It's been quite a while since I made a video about our living wall system here at our little half-acre spot where Sasha and I live. And so I thought I would take a video of this whole scene in kind of a real lull moment. We're at the end of winter, beginning of spring, and lots of gaps right now, which is kind of par for the course for a system like this. I'll talk about what is working, what feels promising, and what has been some interesting failures, so stick around. One key aspect that's just been such a keystone, wonderful element to this whole thing is the giant miscanthus grass, these big, beautiful yellow grasses in front of us. Every year they just get thicker, they do well each year, even in the fall when some of these were pinned right down to the ground with snow. Once the snow melted, they rebounded beautifully. And I started a trial earlier in the winter. I kind of wish I had spent more time to do it, but I didn't, and that's fine, but whatever. You can see where I went through and cut a bunch of these. Once they're dormant, they're dead, these stalks, and they really do need to be cut back at the end of winter. But early in the winter, when I saw them pinned down by the snow, I thought, let me cut some of these off to remove this extra weight at this top heavy weight. And so I cut those and wove them into the fence here. And my gosh, what a solid element. So even with no vegetation actively leafing out and growing right now, the dead stalks, I mean, we've done this in the past with the stalks, but the tops with their very broad leaves. So this was done November, December. All winter they held up just fine. Heavy snow, heavy winds. Maybe they'll break down sometime this spring, but really beautiful. And had I gone through and actually topped them all, they probably would be in a much tidier way and we could have gotten more visual barrier, but what are you gonna do? You can see how they're all bowing. Basically, they lean a little bit to the north, to my side, on this side, and you can see where some of them got enough snow banking on them early in the winter that they were damaged, and they've just been standing kind of half broken. The really great news though is by taking these dead stalks each year and weaving them into the existing fence line, even before anything leaves out in the spring, you can barely tell what's going on. All that crazy chicken insanity on the other side of that fence, you'd have almost no idea. A couple little gaps here or there. I spot a chicken, I know what's going on. And again, you can see on this east side, the northeast corner, where I spent a little bit of time weaving some more visual barrier in the fall from what I trimmed off the tops of these. It's a nice idea that each year you can harvest stalks, work with them, and then they're just going to renew and expand. And you can even see where I've left some stalks that I cut down. My plan will be to take these and incorporate them as deer deflection around some of the young plantings in our neighbor's property, which is right here. So I can cut these in half, stick them in rings around these young trees and support them. So all these different layers of benefit that the miscanthus offers, what a wonderful element. On this side of the driveway, the west side, went for a different design. Could have just done the miscanthus all the way through, and I think that would have been more uniform and more functional, but it's nice to learn and experiment. This is where I put in curly willow cuttings a number of years ago, 3 years or 4 years ago now, right down the line. But I mentioned this in a past video, and I'm really seeing it in a serious way. Some of these willows, I don't know exactly what's going on, but they've died. And it could be that there was just too much competition, just too much complexity in here. Was it a disease that ran through them? I don't know. I think it's more about light competition or root congestion. But here's one that's just a beautiful specimen, very, very healthy. Taken tons of cuttings. It'll be sprouting back like mad very shortly. And then just a few feet over, this one just straight up died. So I probably will cut this out just to make some more light and air for the other elements. But part of me thinks, well, maybe I'll just leave it as a dead element, because down below, the Schisandra, the garlic mustard, but the Schisandra that I've planted in here, which are a perennial medicine-making vine, they're starting to come into their own, and perhaps they can use the scaffold of this dead willow as their trellis, and they'll green up the willow and work with it. So maybe it's a blessing in disguise that the willow lost its canopy here, but is now a structurally sound for now element for the vining layer in this. Well, maybe we'll just leave it. That's the least effort, so one of my favorite ways to go. I definitely wouldn't say at all that the curly willow is a complete loss, because most of them, a lot of them in here, are looking just fine. Lots of new leaves coming out. They'll be beautiful in no time. This far end, surprisingly, even under the shade of this big tulip poplar, seems to be doing really well. But there's definitely some dead elements. A live stem, but a dead stem. This one's completely dead. But again, Schisandra is right below there, so perhaps it was meant to be as a trellis for Schisandra. But a critical takeaway from this is that if I had said early on, I'm going to just plant curly willow down this whole line as my living wall, I'd be in a pretty sad space right now. I'd have about 30% mortality and 3 years lost. I'd have to start from scratch in these areas. But because I started with curly willow, and then the next year I added in, for example, cuttings of elderberry, which are doing incredibly well here. I mean, just so happy. The elderberry's filling in. Another elderberry coming in like crazy. And here's a red bud that is very happy and in fact will be flowering in another few weeks. More red bud, there's aronia underneath. What happens is that the willows passing away or kind of stumbling or having problems means a light release and a nutrient release for other casts of characters to fill in and shine. So it's just so much a reminder that diversity always is the way to go. There's probably 15 different species in here, all acting towards the common goal of blocking the road, and one of them is failing. That's fine. So you can see from this side just how much these plants are leaning out towards the sun. There's way more sun, if only they can get over here. So they're gonna continue to do that this year, I suspect, which leads me to the idea that more shade tolerant or loving plants can happen on the inside of this. And I'm seeing, for example, in this area we're trialing Nanking cherry as a shade tolerant element. It seems to be doing pretty well. It's not leaning very hard towards the sun. And this year there are flower buds. They're really waiting to open because they're in such a cool and shaded spot. But we should get a nice beautiful flower in here soon enough, and it'll be interesting to see if they can actually produce fruit in this much shade and competition. The river locust, Amorpha fruticosa, has their incredible seeds from last year, which we'll strip soon enough and use for our nursery. So we're already getting seeds and propagation material from this space. I'll just see what happens with that. There's plenty more where that came from. These are such seedy plants. It's gonna be interesting over time. I think with this much shade, they won't dominate in here, but they'll be around. And one element that I think I could have designed more in, and perhaps we'll add some more in if we do get more gaps, are these honeyberries. They're getting a bit more sun here, but my gosh, they leaf out so early. Their flowers are even starting to wrap up now. And that's a lot of vegetative density. So maybe honeyberry can fill in if the Schisandra doesn't do so well where the willows have died. This is like the absolute least flattering moment for an installation like this, because we can see the bare soil because it's still waking up. All the trenching work I did this winter is still raw, hasn't filled in with vegetation. Flowers haven't popped yet, and the leaves haven't opened, so you can see just how much more work there is to be done. So take it with a grain of salt. This is, it's still a work in progress, but in another few weeks, the leaves will be out enough that you really can't see through here. But with all of this diversity and density, we're learning so much about who can work in this context and who can't really handle it. The next pass of work that will happen sooner than later is for Sasha and I to go through with loppers and cut all of the miscanthus stalks flush low to the ground and move them out. We'll think about, do they get woven in, or do we work with them for pea trellises and other infrastructure? But we want to open that up to allow light to wake up this year's growth of miscanthus, but also, maybe more importantly, to allow light to penetrate through to the layer just to the north of them, where the elderberries are leafing out, some of the willows we installed, the poplars, the Helianthus giganteus or the perennial sunflower, there are a lot of characters in this layer that could use more light and warmth now that we're coming out of late winter and getting into the warmer time of spring. So that's the big management stroke for this spring. It'll make it look a little bit more bare and raw for a minute, but it'll stimulate a lot of growth here. I tend to really focus on the shrub and tree layer with this, but there's so much more happening down in the herbaceous layer. I've been floored with how well, sorry, even with the quarantine, people manage to drive constantly. It's amazing. These irises have handled all the road salt. They've been driven over many times in the winter, and they're gonna make flowers this year. It's pretty stunning. I think I would take the effort this spring and move them right down this whole line and fill them out for sure. We can see coltsfoot. The little leaves are starting to pop. There'll be a beautiful ground cover here in the moist shade of this. God, it's amazing how many cars there are today. Sorry about that. Their flowers are doing their thing, so bees and flies can get a little pollen and a little nectar flow. Lungwort, able to handle the shady conditions here, providing some nice beauty and some browse for the bees. There's a lot of diversity down in here. We've added in oregano and Turkish rocket. There's valerian, there's sweet Sicily, there's rue, there's dwarf running comfrey, there's standard comfrey, there's garlic mustard, which showed up, which we leave wherever there are gaps, but we pull it where it's in the way. We have rhubarb underneath getting the spring light, providing us a crop. Hablitzia, the perennial green, which will start weaving its way through all this. So probably 10 to 20 different species of shrub and tree layer, probably around 20 or 30 herbaceous perennials in the understory. It's really fun to have this much happening this close, but I'm getting tired of hearing all this road noise, so I'm guessing you are too. So we'll leave it here. The ugliest, least alive moment in the early spring, late winter of a living wall system in a northern climate. So we'll take another look at this again when the Nankings are in peak flower and the miscanthus is starting to wake up and it feels like it's a little more impressive. But it's good to see the dead, the dying, and the reawakening at this point too.